wanted to be a journalist. I was already working for the McGill Daily, and I was studying Canadian history. And I was going to walking off campus and down to the old Bay store. Back then it was called Morgan's, but it was the Hudson Bay store. And right on Union and St. Catherine, there was a plaque, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And it was a plaque to Jefferson Davis, the leader of the slave South. And I remember thinking, why is there a plaque to the leader of the slavocracy in my city? And why is it still here more than 150 years after the war? And about 50 or 60 years later, I found the answers in researching this book. I'll try to run through some of the highlights, especially the highlights of Montreal, because Montreal during the Civil War was a kind of Casablanca. It was a city of intrigue and spies and scoundrels. And you won't believe some of the stories that came out of our city. There'll be time for questions at the end, but I personally like it. If you have questions as I'm going along about something I'm saying, put up your hand, and I think it'll make a much more fun discussion, because I gather we're all Montrealers and we love our city. And let's find out a bit of the dark side of our city. Martin Luther King, 1967, a year before he's assassinated, is speaking in Toronto. And he says, deep in our history of struggle for freedom, Canada was the North Star. So standing today in Canada, I am linked with the history of my people and its unity with your past. And he was referring, and that's why the book is called The North Star. Canada was called the North Star because if you followed the North Star, if you were an enslaved person in the South and you followed the North Star in the sky, you would eventually make it to Canada. And the minute you made it to Canada, you were free. We had abolished slavery because we were part of the British Empire, which had abolished slavery in the 1830s. So that's a very proud part of our history. Montreal welcomed many, many slaves. So did Southern Ontario. That's the story I was always told as a history student. Canada was on the good side of the war. We were the last stop on the Underground Railroad. But when I discovered this plaque on the Bay store, which heralded Jefferson Davis, I realized there was a darker side that wasn't in our history books. The Underground Railroad brought at least 30,000 enslaved people to Canada. Many of their ancestors are still here. And that's why Canada was so famous for being on the good side, the side of liberty and freedom in the Civil War. This is what Canada was like back in the 1860s. Canada East was what we now call Quebec. Canada West was Ontario. And we were obviously, as we still are, very close to the United States. And the United States was gripped by a civil war. What's important to understand about the Civil War is we think of the North versus the South, but the South started what is now a couple of subway stops away from Washington, right? The South wasn't just Alabama and Mississippi, it was Virginia, which now you could walk across a bridge. Lincoln could see with binoculars the Confederate flags. So this was an intense civil war, and Canada, being part of being a British colony, declared itself neutral. So think about that. We were kind of saying between a democratically elected government of Lincoln and the South supporting slavery, Canada was kind of saying, we're not going to choose sides here. What that meant is for Confederates, they could come to Canada, live here peacefully, raise money, bank, put out their propaganda, and in fact, engage in what we would now call terrorism against the North. And that's exactly what they did. Civil War was brutal. More soldiers and Americans died in the Civil War, about 750,000 Americans, than in all the wars America waged combined, right? World War I, World War II, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, all those wars combined did not equal the amount of people who died, Americans who died, because they were killing each other. instead of foreigners. So it was a bloody, bloody war. 1864, the war is beginning to turn badly for the Confederates. First couple of years, it was going quite well. The book opens with a battle. The first battle is called the Battle of Bull Run, and Lincoln and everybody thought the war would be over in a few weeks. So they literally came with lunch buckets and binoculars. It was outside Washington to kind of watch the first battle, figuring the war would be over that day or soon. It would last 4 years. Halfway in the war, 1864, the South is beginning, if not to lose, a path to victory wasn't clear. The Northern armies were much bigger. They had much more money. They were beginning to rampage through the South. So Jefferson Davis, the president, and his Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, set up a secret fund. You could see the document here in the slide for $1 million. Back then, something like 16 million today, to set up secret services in foreign countries. And most of that money would go to Canada and to Montreal. This man, Jacob Thompson, was designated the head of the Confederate Secret Service, and he opens a bank account. I'll show you the bank in a minute. You can still see the corner where his bank existed. And he put in something like $650,000, again, the equivalent of millions of dollars, in the bank. The bank, there's the building now. It's the building right next to the Basilica in Old Montreal. This building no longer exists. The one facing it does. It was run by this man, Henry Starnes. Henry Starnes was mayor of Montreal twice before the Civil War and would be mayor after the Civil War. He runs the Ontario Bank, it was called, and the Confederates operate there. After Lincoln is assassinated, there's an investigation, a conspiracy trial, and Starnes's involvement gets exposed because the bank knew it was offering financial service to the Confederates. They said they admitted that they were basically money laundering. The checks would come in, they would issue the checks in anonymous names, and they would say, oh yes, we knew Jacob Thompson, we knew he was a Confederate leader. What he did with the money, we didn't know. And we'll find out in a few minutes what they did with that money. So the Confederates knew that they had huge support from the banking elite. Starnes went on to become a politician and was close to both the Liberals and the Conservative Party. Our prime minister, first prime minister, the father of Confederation, John A. Macdonald. It's 1864. He's attending one of the founding conferences of our country. Canada will be born 2 years after the end of the Civil War. This is what he says at the conference. He talks about the gallant defense that is being made by the Southern Republic. At this moment, they have not much more than 4 million of men, yet what a brave fight they have made. And this is 3 years into the war when it's obvious the war is about slavery and freedom. And the man who will found our country is cheering the South. Canada's third prime minister, John Abbott, was the dean of the McGill Law School. As a lawyer, one of the most prominent lawyers in 1864, we'll see in a few moments how he will successfully defend the most famous Confederate terrorists, that's what they were, a gang from Montreal who crossed the border into Vermont, robbed 3 banks, killed an innocent person, and Abbott would defend them in a case in Montreal. The Montreal Gazette, our beloved paper, founded by Benjamin Franklin, was, like most newspapers, French and English, Ontario and Quebec, ferociously anti-Lincoln and pro-South. There was one paper in Montreal that was pro-Lincoln. There was one paper in Ontario that was pro-Lincoln, the Globe, but the Gazette was not. This is an example of what the Gazette was writing as the war started. It had a correspondent, a letter that said, all white men who are planters are necessarily slave owners, and of course, interested in the preservation of their lives and property. Another commentator in the Gazette was worried that the blacks be permitted to rise and massacre their masters and their families. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, what we now know is one of his biggest achievements. What does the Gazette say? The Gazette doesn't hail it. They say the proclamation will be little more than an indecent exposure of Lincoln's rage and fiendishness. That's what our paper said about the freeing of the slaves. And the Gazette wasn't alone. The French papers, La Minerve, Le Canadien, the biggest paper in Toronto, the Toronto Leader, all echoed these words. The church, the Catholic Church, was very conservative, very traditional, and favored the South. The leading archbishop in Halifax, named Thomas Connolly, issued a letter of support to the Confederates and sent it to all Catholic Church members across the country, urging them to support the South. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the Quebec Church played an active role in hiding one of the accused accomplices of Lincoln's assassination. So 1864, this is what Montreal looked like if you were standing on the Basilica. And actually in the corner right there, you see the pillars. That's building is still there. And on the left, you could see the bank. That was the bank where the Confederates hid their money. And just over to the left, now on Notre Dame Street and Saint-François-Xavier, if you walk there, I was just there a few days ago, this building looks very similar. It became the Gazette building, ironically, more recently. That was the St. Lawrence Hall. St. Lawrence Hall was the fanciest hotel in what was then called British North America. Huge chandeliers, a ballroom. This was the advertisement, right? A concert room, a reading room. They had telegraphs so that the Southerners who flocked there could get the latest information, the Southern newspapers. The owner was a man named Henry Hogan, and he said his hotel was the headquarters for the Confederate junta. On any given day, you would find dozens, if not hundreds, of Confederate agents who made their headquarters at the St. Lawrence Hall. This was the lush dining room. And one of the guests was a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth. You could see his signature there. John Wilkes Booth comes to Montreal in October 1864. Why not? He knows that it's Confederate headquarters. It's the Casablanca during the Civil War. He was, to kind of draw a modern analogy, sort of like the Brad Pitt of the 1860s. He was young, handsome, a huge star. He played in theaters all across America, but he was ferociously pro-South and anti-Lincoln. He comes to Montreal to meet with Confederate agents. He will get the names of 2 people who will help him when he escapes the night he assassinates Lincoln. In October, he's already hatching a plan to kidnap Lincoln. His original plan was to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom so that the Union would free all the Confederate soldiers that were being held in prison. Although kidnapping the president would probably lead to his murder. And of course, that's what he lands up doing. If Montreal was the Casablanca of the Civil War, this is Rick's Cafe. It was Dooley's bar, and it was famous. One of the persons who would hang out there was a man named Joseph Dion, who was the Quebec billiards champion. And one night, a somewhat drunk John Wilkes Booth, who just before, by the way, had taken a horse ride down to Lachine, right, in the cold winter. And he came back, quite surprised how cold it was. He was seen playing cards with Confederate agents and throwing money to the newspaper boys so he could read the latest stories about Confederate battles. But on the night he decides to play pool, he starts boasting. And Lincoln is up for re-election in a few weeks, Lincoln's second election. And Booth utters these chilling words. He says, "It made damn little difference who will win, head or tail. Abe's contract was nearly up. Whether re-elected or not, he would get his goose cooked." 6 months later, those words would mean a lot more, because that's exactly what John Wilkes Booth would do. He would kill Abraham Lincoln. Nobody knew that Lincoln, when he got elected, a few weeks after Booth uttered these words, that would be the last election for Abraham Lincoln. We'll come back to Mr. Booth later. So he's enjoying Montreal, as are all the Confederates. Just before he leaves, he goes to Henry Starnes' bank, and he takes out this, it was called the bank draft. It's the equivalent of traveler's check. And in the trial, it actually comes out that they interview the chief teller. So Booth shows up and he says, "Can I have 500?" It lands up being about $300 US. He takes it out in British currency. I'm going to be running the blockade. In other words, he says, "I'm going to be heading into the north and maybe trying to sneak into the south." And the teller says, "Don't worry." And he says, "So can anybody else use this money?" And the teller says, "No, it's only you. It's signed out to you. It's safe." And then later in the trial, the teller is asked, did you know what he was going to use the money for? And he said, "We never ask, right? We give them the money and they use it as they want." Now, the consequences of the support given by the bankers, the newspapers, the politicians, was that the Confederates, rich with $1 million sitting in the bank, sent some of their leading terrorists. They were called Morgan's Raiders. These were ferocious, quite talented young guerrillas who were fighting their way all through Kentucky, and they were terrorizing the Union. And in 1864, these 4 men will be sent to Canada, especially Bennett Young, who we'll talk about shortly. John Headley will lead an attack on New York. The other men will lead attacks on Chicago. So John Headley heads to New York in November 1864, the election that Booth said wouldn't matter because Lincoln was going to get killed. And they set fire to 19 hotels on Broadway. They were hoping to burn down New York. They used a primitive form of what we now call Molotov cocktails. They were called Greek fire back then. So the men checked in to multiple hotels, stuffed clothing and linen on the beds, set it on fire and ran out. And as you can imagine, the panic in the city. Now, miraculously, no one died because they made a mistake. They closed all the doors and the windows in the room, and that smothered the oxygen. So thank God the Confederates didn't know their science, but the panic was quite huge. And in the headlines the next day in the New York Times, they said this was an attack from Canada. They knew these were Canadian terrorists, Canadian-based terrorists. That was John Headley. Dr. Luke Blackburn loved to hang out in Montreal. He would stay at the St. Lawrence Hotel. He was probably the leading doctor when it came to fighting yellow fever. Yellow fever was an enormous scourge all through the South. He made his name. He got his doctor's license before he finished his teenage years. And then he would work in all the places where there was yellow fever. And 1864, he volunteers to go down to Bermuda to help them with their plague. And the British Admiralty will give him an award because he refuses money. But a couple of nurses are kind of noticing that he would take the soiled linen and bedclothes from the dying people and hide it away. And when people would vomit, the yellow fever was called the black vomit. It was the last thing you did before you died. He would take the linens or the handkerchiefs and store it. What they didn't know is he was packing what he thought was infected clothing filled with yellow fever, stored it in 6 trunks and shipped it, where else? To Canada, to Halifax. And from Halifax, he hired somebody to send the trunks all through the northern states, including one package he wanted to send to Lincoln. This was bioterrorism. This was the first attempted bioterrorism. What Dr. Luke Blackburn didn't know, and we only found out in 1901, that yellow fever comes from mosquitoes, doesn't come from clothing. But at the time, he thought he was spreading and he hoped tens of thousands of people would die. And in fact, when it was exposed, again, it made headlines in the New York papers saying the yellow fever plot. I wonder if well, we'll jump ahead. We'll wait. I'll let you know what happened to him after the war. You won't believe it. Bennett Young, charming. He's a religious student. He quits the ministry, and from Montreal and Toronto, he leads a raid in St. Albans. Anybody here go skiing the minute you cross the border? That's the first town we meet. St. Albans is where we usually stop for a coffee or beef jerky. Well, they stopped to rob 3 banks of $250,000, again, worth millions. They cross the border, they kill 1 innocent bystander. Bennett Young and his gang cross the border. They're chased by a posse, and almost all of them are arrested. Most of the money disappears, but not about 80,000. They're put on trial. This prison, it looks exactly like that to this day. If you go down to the Jacques Cartier Bridge, just the foot of the bridge, you will see this prison. This is called this is where they hanged the patriots, les patriotes, in the 1830s during so they hanged the men who were fighting for freedom in Canada. These Confederate terrorists were treated, they called it Payette's Hotel. The jailer was Payette, and he put out linen and fine wine, and all the elites of Montreal would come to visit these stars, these famous raiders. Bennett Young, who's on the far right, landed up seducing and having an affair with the judge's daughter. So he would get the inside track of what was happening. The Judge Charles Courceau, by the way, just walked down from the Atwater Library, just past Saint-Jacques. That street is Courceau, named after the judge, and there's a plaque. What that plaque doesn't say is Judge Courceau gives the money for safekeeping to the police chief, Guillaume Lamotte. Lamotte will then meet with the Confederates as the trial is going on. And a couple of days before Courceau is about to issue his ruling, Lamotte gives the money in a bag to the Confederate agents, who will take the money and store it where? Henry Starnes's bank. Courceau rules that he has no jurisdiction and acquits the raiders. He will later be investigated for malfeasance. The crowd breaks out in cheers. The raiders jump on a sleigh that's waiting for them outside the courthouse, dash to the Ontario Bank near the Basilica, steal the money a second time, basically, and ride off. Some of them will be arrested. And by the way, in this trial, they're defended by who? The Dean of McGill's Law School, John Abbott, and a future prime minister. You can't make this stuff up, right? If it was a movie, they'd say, that's not believable, right? And they will be rearrested, and they'll be acquitted again by another judge who says, well, we really can't do anything. And what's interesting is the defense by the Confederates. They admitted they robbed the banks. They said, but we weren't robbers. We didn't have masks. We did it we were political operatives. We were freedom fighters. Just the freedom they were fighting for was for the South to keep 4 million people enslaved. And you can imagine the fury when they were acquitted by the Lincoln government. In fact, one of the things the Lincoln government did, you can thank the Confederates, they were so upset with Canada being a bastion, a haven for Confederates, they imposed passports between the Canadian and American borders. Now, the man who is furious and is trying to prosecute the Confederates and will then go after the police chief at City Council is Bernard Devlin. He's a City Council member. He will launch an investigation and force Lamotte to resign. And this is the speech he makes at City Hall to huge applause when he says that, you know, great good or great evil will mark the result of this decision. Have we not countenanced and sanctioned aggression upon the United States? And thanks to his eloquent speech, Lamotte, the City Council will vote against Lamotte, and he's forced to resign. By the way, Devlin helped create what we now know as the mountain, as Park Mount Royal on the mountain. And so these people are finally forced somewhat in disgrace, but very quickly, Lamotte and Courcelles will do very well, and Courcelles will go on to have a great career, as will Lamotte, unscathed by what they carried out. That all takes place in November, December. Lamotte will continue to work for the Confederates. In fact, he's now in civilian clothes. He helps Confederates escape through Lévis in Quebec, and then he hires a schooner to get them to Halifax, where the Confederate terrorists make their way back to the South. He even has to lie to his ex-fellow officers because he's no longer a policeman. And at one point when they're looking for the Confederates, Lamotte says, I haven't seen them, right? And he has snuck them away. April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, as he had warned in Montreal, will put a single bullet in the brain of Abraham Lincoln and kill him. We know the story and we know how we would react. But if you were walking through these streets, this building, I think, was here in 1840. No?
Our building then was at 360 Saint Jacques West.
That's right, Saint Jacques West. Okay, so that's why. So this building, back then, if you had stepped out of this building back at Saint Jacques West, if you were walking through the streets of Montreal, and the Telegraph brought the news pretty quickly. So the next day, Saturday morning, was news that Lincoln had been shot. He was still barely alive, and then of course he dies. So you'd open up your Montreal Gazette, and I'm going to skip ahead for a minute. And this is what you would have read. The Montreal Gazette talked about what? The great loss which the South sustains in his death. They noted that we have always questioned the justifiability of the war itself. And they talked about the calamity which his assassination causes to the Southern state as being great. So the Gazette finds a way to worry about the South on the days after that Lincoln is assassinated. Some of the other Canadian papers were worse. The London Examiner said that Booth's deed was literally justified by the facts because the man he killed had murdered the Constitution of the United States. I mean, it's like the Fox News of 1865, right? It's like taking, the attack on Congress and completely turning it upside down. This is saying Booth's assassination was justified. The Niagara Review denounced Lincoln as the mad, blood-stained despot. So that's what you would be reading in most papers in Canada. Now, one man from Montreal, this is a cover of the latest issue of Canada's History, and it's my story about a man named Edward Doherty. He's born in Wickham in the Eastern Townships, comes to Montreal, considers himself a Montrealer, and then he'll move to New York. The war breaks out, and what does he do? As many Canadians do, he signs up right away to fight for the Union cause and to help Lincoln. He rises quickly through the ranks, and on Monday, April 14th, 15th, 17th, 3 days after Lincoln is assassinated, he's sitting in Lafayette Park, the park right opposite the White House, and a messenger comes up, says, you've got to report to the War Department. He shows up, and he's given 2 photographs, and he's given the mission to hunt down John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices. He leads a regiment of 25 people. So a Montrealer is now leading the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, who was in Montreal, saying he would kill Abraham Lincoln. After 12 days, Doherty will track down Booth to a farm in Virginia. The farm will be set ablaze. Booth will be shot and killed. And as they're huddling, as Doherty and the men are huddling over a dying Booth, they find in his back pocket the bank draft from Montreal signed by Henry Starnes. So Montrealers were literally on both sides of the assassination of Lincoln. Now, Booth's closest friend was John Surratt, not an actor, but very handsome. He was a well-known Confederate courier, a spy, and his mission was to take messages from Confederate headquarters in Richmond to Montreal, because that's where so many Confederates were hanging out. He would go regularly to Montreal and stay at the St. Lawrence Hall. Well, he happens to be in Montreal as Lincoln is being assassinated. The John Wilkes Booth, everybody knew him. It would be like Brad Pitt shooting the president, right? He's on stage. Everybody knows that's John Wilkes Booth. And the police know John Wilkes Booth is very close to John Surratt. So they rush that night that Lincoln is killed to John Surratt's mother, Mary Surratt, who's running a boarding house. They say, "Where's your son? Where's Booth?" And she says, quite honestly, "My son's in Montreal." So they dash to Montreal, and Booth is where? At the St. Lawrence Hall. But as the police kind of come, he sneaks out the back. He hides first in one house by a Confederate agent, and then the Confederates realize Montreal is too hot, so they call on one of the leading church officials in Montreal and say, "Can you help us, Father Lapierre?" And he says yes, and he sends Booth to the delightful town of Saint-Liboire, which is just on the other side of the Champlain Bridge, about 20 minutes from Montreal. And a priest named Father Boucher will hide him in his house for quite a lot of time. Finally, it's decided that even that's not safe. So Father Boucher and others organize for him first to go to La Malbaie, and then back to Montreal, where he is housed in the shelter of another leading church official. They realize this by now. This is September. He's been on the run, hidden by the church. It's very similar to what the church did with the Nazis, right, in World War II. This rat line, right? So the Catholic Church in Quebec has organized this rat line to hide Surratt, and they finally realize it's too dangerous. So they send a letter recommending him to the Pope, and he joins the Pope's army, the Papal Zouaves, and he'll hide out for quite a long time in Italy until he's discovered by another Montrealer who turns him in, and he will eventually be brought back to the US and stand trial, where he will be acquitted. His mother, though, as you probably know, Mary Surratt, is executed, first woman ever executed by the US government. And one of the criticisms made of Surratt is he's hiding out in this lush Quebec town while his mother is swinging in the gallows, and he never comes forward to save her. The war is over. The South has lost. Hundreds of thousands have died. Jefferson Davis, the leader of the slave South, is in jail for a couple of years, and then he gets out on bail. And that night, there's a bit of a celebration, and he gets on a train. Where does he go? Memphis, Mississippi. Any guesses of another town that begins with M? Yes, he comes to Montreal. Literally, like, he just gets on the train, goes straight to Montreal, and he'll stay at many places. There's a gentleman here pointed out that there's a house he stayed on Mountain Street, which is still there. But one of the places he stayed was the house of a rich publisher named John Lovell, Lovell's Directory. Lovell would publish a lot of propaganda for the Confederates, and Lovell's house was where the bay now stands. That's why the plaque is there, because one of the leading elites financiers of Montreal housed Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis will say, and these are his words, I mean, we're not making it up. This is what the leader of the slavocracy says. He says, "May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now an asylum to myself." As he's hanging out in Montreal, he takes an evening to go to the Théâtre Royal, kind of like the Centaur of the 1860s. It's down on Côté Street, near where the Palais de Congrès is now. He shows up a little late. It's a benefit for the South. So think about that. Why is Montreal holding a benefit for the South? The crowd notices him. So the play stops. The band starts playing Dixie. The crowd rises to its feet and cheers him and cries out, "Dixie will live again." He wouldn't get this reception in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. He gets it in Montreal. He's so popular, he's asked to come to Toronto, where thousands will greet him at the port. And then he goes to Niagara and St. Catharines, and he makes this speech. His kids, by the way, are at school at Bishop's, and he will hang out for quite a while in the Eastern Townships and love it there. This is where the theater took place, where he gets cheered. Now, the good news, let me just back up a bit, is while the bankers, the politicians, the newspaper publishers, the police chiefs, the judges were on the side, or at least had sympathy for the South, most or many ordinary Canadians fought on the side of the Union. We don't have exact numbers, but it's estimated anywhere from 30 to maybe 50,000 Canadians and a huge number of Quebecois, because a lot of French Quebecers were already living in the States because of poverty all through New England. So in fact, there were some regiments that had, 5 to 10% Francophones from Quebec. That's how many French Quebecers had joined the Union cause. Edward Doherty, who would hunt down Booth, and many others joined the Union side. A handful joined the Confederates, but partly because it was so close, it was obviously easier to join the North, but because of sympathy for the side of Lincoln. Two of the most famous were young Black men who had graduated and became the first Black doctors in Canada. Now, a little known part of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is wrongly seen as the document that freed the slaves. Well, it didn't really free the slaves. Lincoln didn't say slaves are freed because slavery is bad. What the proclamation said is, we're at war, and if we invade one of your states, those slaves, your property will be freed and you won't get compensation. Previous to that, they would get compensation. So Lincoln, because he knew there was not a lot of sympathy, even in the North, for freeing the slaves, presented the emancipation as a military tactic. We'll invade, we'll take away your workforce. That left 1 million slaves still enslaved because they were not part of the Southern Empire. And the book tracks Lincoln's slow journey to taking a just position. But as a lawyer, Lincoln defended, he acted on behalf of a slave owner who was trying to get back slaves who had run away and punish the people who had harbored him. Lincoln, upon meeting, he met some Blacks at a meeting, and he says openly that Blacks and whites can never really live together, and whites are superior to Blacks. By our standards, he would be considered quite racist. But at the time, and the best words would be Frederick Douglass, the Martin Luther King of the 19th century, a former slave, Black civil rights lawyer who calls his newspaper the North Star, will say of Lincoln that by our standards, he was slow, he was tardy, he was reluctant. But for a white man in a white country, he was amazingly forceful in fighting for justice. I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's the context you have to look at Abraham Lincoln. And he moves, he progresses, and he lands up, of course, playing an important role in freedom. Well, a little known part of the Emancipation Proclamation, right at the end of the Emancipation Proclamation, because it's basically a military document saying we have to win this war, it says Black men can now join the Union Army. That was revolutionary. You were giving guns to Black men. And that's what happened. Those of you who saw the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, Black regiments were formed. By the way, 4 Canadians will die in that regiment that's featured in the movie Glory. Most of the Black soldiers died at an enormous rate because they were given substandard care, substandard equipment. But within days of the Emancipation Proclamation, these 2 gentlemen will write to the Lincoln government from Toronto and say, we want to join. The first, Dr. Alexander Augusta, was an American Black, free Black man in Philadelphia, wants to become a doctor, studies secretly as he's working as a barber, applies to schools in the States, can't get accepted, comes to Toronto and graduates as Canada's first doctor at U of T. And he will mentor Dr. Anderson Abbott, who's a young Canadian-born Black. His parents are also free Blacks who hate the racism of Alabama, come to Toronto, push their son through some of the best schools, fight in the anti-abolitionist movement, and Anderson, being mentored by Alexander, will become Canada's first native-born Black doctor. 1864, they both write to, one writes personally to Lincoln, the other writes to the administration. They will be accepted into Lincoln's Union Army as some of the first Black surgeons. In fact, Alexander Augusta will rise to be the highest ranking Black officer in the U.S. The two men, it's tough. Their hospital is kind of full of water and sewage. The Blacks are dying at horrible rates, but they do the best they can. And one night they decide to crash a party. The party was at the White House. Lincoln is holding a levee in early 1864. The two men, can you imagine, Black men in a spiffy uniform, walk into the White House. According to Abbott, the heads are turning. It was the North, but there was still plenty of discrimination. And there's a bit of a hush, and Lincoln shakes their hands. And there's still a huge hush, and monocles are dropping. The mouths are agape. And Abbott writes about this, and it gets written up in the papers. And it shows how two Canadians, or two Black doctors from Canada, would make history. And so that was also part of our contribution. And this is what Abbott wrote when he said it was not a war for white men or Black men, red men or yellow men. It was a war for humanity. And he talked about the thousands of Canadians who shed blood in order to fight for freedom. This woman, Emma Edmonds, was a farm girl in New Brunswick, chafed at the restrictions against women, disguised herself as a man so she could be a Bible salesman, was quite successful, hugely successful. She moves to the States, and when the war breaks out, she does exactly what Edward Doherty does. She joins the army as a man. It was pretty easy. The clothing was loose. Basically, if you had a pulse, you could join the Union Army. They didn't do much of a medical check, obviously. She joins the army and she will spend 2 years fighting for the Union, will then desert, and will then write a tell-all book, and she will become one of the most famous women who fought for the Union Army, openly talks about being Canadian. And it's an important theme of the book because she will say, this was not my war, this was not my country, I had to make a choice. And that's what the book is about, the choices people made, the choices you have to make today. What side are you on, right? Several Canadians were on the side of the Union, but as we saw, many powerful Canadians were on the side of the South. Her case will go all the way to Congress 30 years after the war because she was ruled a deserter under her male name and never got a pension. She fights for pension. Congress passes a bill in her name declaring her a legitimate soldier under her name as a woman, and all her old male comrades will support her. And so she becomes quite famous. What about Bennett Young? Remember Bennett Young? The book ends with the lost cause, and that's where I want to end our talk. The Civil War, as far as I know, is the only war where the losers got to write history. Most wars, by definition, the victors write the story. But the Civil War was different. It was called the lost cause. Right after the war, the South started saying, we should be sure that history remembers us well. We were not fighting for slavery. We were fighting for states' rights. There was justness on both sides. Point being, yeah, states' rights not for the lumber trade, states' rights to preserve slavery. But the lost cause became vitally important. Bennett Young, the terrorist who led the St. Albans raid, will lead the lost cause, become the general of what was called the United Confederate Veterans. And in 1914, there he is at Arlington Cemetery next to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. They are erecting a huge monument to Confederate soldiers. And the monument actually talks about the lost cause in Arlington National Cemetery, which back then was segregated. So Dr. Alexander Augusta, the Black doctor, was in a lower part, a segregated part of the cemetery. Then we saw Birth of the Nation, right? The first movie that Hollywood ever made, which was basically about the Klan. Gone with the Wind, to this day, the most successful movie, also heralded the South and the lost cause. So that propaganda continued. 1959, Jefferson Davis, while he's staying here, his mother-in-law will pass away. So she's buried at the Mount Royal Cemetery anonymously. Well, in the late 1950s, a man from the Eastern Townships wants to commemorate her. So as you can see, he changes the tombstone and puts out a Confederate flag. It's 1959 now. The Gazette still hasn't figured it out. So they put this on the front page, and then they write an editorial, right? And they talk about draped over the tombstone was a specially made Confederate flag. And then in an editorial, it said, it was an act of gracious remembrance for a family sorely tried by the misfortunes of history. Yeah, right. Right. This is the leader of slavery, right? Who is heralded in Montreal, cheered in Montreal. And then in 1959, the Gazette is still cheering him on. But as we now know, in the last few years, the statues start coming down because of Black Lives Matter and huge debates. By the way, Ron DeSantis, who is leading the fight, in Florida to change the history books, there's a new law that was passed that you can't talk about certain aspects of racism, much less slavery. The group that put out this plaque, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, were the first ones to start what DeSantis is doing now. Right after the war, they said, we have to be sure the history books don't talk in a negative way about slavery and racism. They began the rewriting of history. So what DeSantis is doing now, and others who are trying to rewrite history, is following in the footsteps. 2017, I'm sitting at my office in Toronto at the CBC, and I realized the statues are going down. I called my daughter, who at the time was working at Montreal CBC, and I said, Miriam, you should check. Back in the day, there used to be a plaque for Jefferson Davis. CBC goes down, the plaque is there, the Bay takes it down that day. The point being, though, is we can't just take down the plaque, right? And pretend it didn't happen. It's important actually to keep plaques like that or something like it up and explain our history and the sad truth. Just a few weeks ago, another plaque went up in Toronto to the two doctors, the two Black doctors who were pioneers. So slowly we're rewriting history the way we should rewrite it. Speaking of the Montreal Gazette, a few weeks ago, some of you may have seen this front page. It actually looks like it was written during the Civil War, but this article was written by me, and the Gazette put it on the front page and talked about what I talked about here. So we are moving, we are changing, but I think the hidden history is still there. So you can find out a lot more about my book on my website. There's lots of articles you could read and interviews and videos to watch.